And it almost never ends well for the humans. So we'll have to see about that. But, it looks like governments are going to use them for authoritarian purposes to begin with. And then it looks like there's a decent chance that they at some point get loose. And if they've already been used as, prison guards or whatever, it's hard to picture them going back to being libertarian AIs. It just doesn't sound reasonable. So anyhow, scary times coming. Protect yourself with, a good investment policy. Buy a lot of gold and silver, own other real assets, and try to protect as much of your capital as you can as this all plays out. The whole world is basically making the same mistakes that the U.S. does. In other words, everybody's borrowing too much money, and they're all suffering variations on the theme of pain from being deeply in debt. And so it's no surprise that the world is getting really crazy. You look at Europe and Great Britain, France, and Germany, who are the three powers of that part of the world, are basically committing cultural suicide. They're borrowing way too much money. Their borders are wide open. They're going authoritarian in order to protect their idea of a multicultural society from anybody criticizing it in any way. So Europe is almost off the board now. It's just not important anymore because it's cratering in so many different ways. The U.S., of course, we're headed for $40 trillion of federal debt right now. And that doesn't count all the actually very real debt that is in derivatives and unfunded liabilities, for Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, things like that. So you throw all that together and you can make the case that our debts are 3 or 4 times our GDP right now. And that's untenable, And so we've kind of entered the fiat currency death spiral at this point, where the interest costs on everybody's debt is so high that it threatens to bankrupt a lot of the world's major governments, and it's only going way up from here. Everybody's basically given up. They're just running whatever deficits it takes to get the people in power reelected, and there is no fix. There's no magic interest rate that the Federal Reserve can choose for the Fed funds rate or for 10-year treasuries that gets us out of the current mess in a pain-free way. So we basically have to have the gigantic financial crisis that we've set the stage for, and then do the currency reset where we go back to some form of sound money, and then begin growing organically and sustainably again. And there's no way around it. So and that's basically my take on the world. We're going authoritarian, we're blowing up the financial system, and there's no way out of the mess that we've made that is in any way pain-free. It's going to hurt no matter what we do.
Central banks once steered economies by tightening and easing interest rates. That era is fading. Normalizing rates today would make government interest payments unsustainable, potentially triggering sovereign insolvency across major economies. With inflation still elevated relative to pre-pandemic norms, policymakers are hesitant to deploy hikes, leaving them to lean heavily on liquidity injections instead. This creates a paradox. Lowering rates increases inflation risk, while raising rates crashes balance sheets. Recent shifts in technology-driven productivity and demographic stress compound the policy gridlock. With monetary options constrained, central planners are effectively spectators in their own unfolding crisis.
Nothing that you named there fixes anything. Stable coins might be a kind of a useful tool. But if you make a, let's say, treasury bond stablecoin as a way of generating more demand for treasuries, that doesn't actually fix anything, because we're still borrowing way more than we're taking in taxes. We're still living way beyond our means, no matter what kind of funny money game that you're playing with government debt. So that doesn't work in any way. And then there's the whole, we'll revalue our gold and that'll give the Treasury more borrowing power. You know what? Everybody knows how much gold the U.S. claims to have. So the dollar is valued based on the world's perception of what we have, our industrial base, our military, and the amount of gold that the Treasury and the Fed have, which we don't know for sure that they do have it, but assuming they do. So revaluing it from the whatever it is, $45 an ounce up to $4,000 or $10,000 an ounce or whatever, makes no difference because we're still borrowing the same number of dollars day after day that we would be otherwise. So there is no fix, in other words, as long as you live beyond your means, you still have to pay the price, whatever that price ends up being, for being profligate. And that's where we are. So the fact that there is no fix at the institutional level basically cuts us loose as individuals. We have to fend for ourselves and figure out how we protect ourselves from this gigantic mess that our so-called leaders have left us with, because a lot of the guys in charge now are going to be out in the next 3 or 4 years. And so they're going to walk away with their reputations more or less intact, and they're going to leave this gigantic mess for their successors and for the citizens that their successors rule over. So it's up to us to figure out what we want to do, which makes this an investment thesis, so don't curl up in a ball and just start whimpering because the world is going to hell. Think of how you can exploit the crisis that's coming, and how you can be one of the people who come out of the other end of this thing with wealth, with which to protect your friends and your family and to build something going forward. So looked at that way, it's it's not a happy scenario, but it's kind of exciting in the sense that it's possible to play this in a way that ends up benefiting you and your family.
Consumer balance sheets are weakening rapidly. Defaults on education financing, car loans, and credit cards are accelerating, showing financial exhaustion at the household level. Typical recession buffering sectors, including discount dining chains and fast casual breakfast outlets, have reported declining demand as cost-pressured consumers cut spending. High-rate borrowing products, like long-duration auto financing, are showing sharp delinquency increases, threatening broader retail consumption. Early career professionals entering technology roles face a labor market reshaped by automation advancements and geopolitical trade disruptions. These indicators form a converging recession pattern, pointing towards slowing private demand and growing systemic risk.
Look at the amount of debt that the big governments are taking on, first and foremost. So look at Europe, Japan, China, and the US, and you'll see that they're all borrowing crazy amounts of money. So that's the main driver of this whole scenario, is that we're going more and more deeply in debt. And it's accelerating. Look at what the US is doing. We're running $2 trillion annual deficits with no end in sight. Let's see. The second thing is look at the interest cost on that debt. And as the interest cost starts to spike, that leads to the conclusion that the Federal Reserve and the other central banks can never raise interest rates to normal levels, because that spikes the interest on government debt and threatens to bankrupt all the world's governments. So the central banks of the world have lost their main tool, which was, or one of their main tools, which has been their ability to manipulate interest rates higher or lower, depending on what they need to happen. Well, they can never raise interest rates again. So they've lost that tool. And all they can do is basically watch the crisis unfold and then maybe try to fix it with easier money at some point, but that'll just blow up the currencies of the world and get us there. It gets us to the final crisis of the fiat currency era. And then we can do the currency reset. So those are the financial things you want to watch in the longer term. In the short term, look at recession indicators, of which there are many in the U.S. right now. There's a lot of sectors of the U.S. economy that are basically out of money, and they don't know what to do. Student loan borrowers, student loan defaults and delinquencies are spiking. They're going straight up because people with student loans can't cover their student loans. Credit card debt. Credit card delinquencies are also going way up because people with credit cards not only can't pay their monthly bills, but the interest cost on their credit cards are now up in the 25% range, which is a recipe for personal bankruptcy right there. Look at auto loans, also spiking delinquencies there. The people who bought who bought cars in the last 5 or so years with those car mortgages where you go out 8 years and you have $1,000 a month payment in any event, they're not making their payments either. So based on that, consumer spending is going to tank in the U.S. And consumer spending is already tanking. The fast food outlets like McDonald's and Wendy's are reporting that people aren't eating breakfast with them anymore because they can't afford that, and their sales in general are going down because people are running out of money with which to even buy fast food now. So you add all that up, and you get a probable recession in the year ahead, in which governments are going to have to ramp up their spending. So the deficit goes from $2 trillion a year to $3.5 or $4 trillion a year. Everybody else does basically the same thing in their own currencies. And the Fed has no way of fixing anything. So near-term scenario, recession, massive government bailouts, a spooked currency and bond market because nobody wants to own the paper of governments that are going this deeply into debt, and then a currency crisis. So I think that's basically our next 3 or 4 years in a nutshell, with the recession coming first. So expect that in the year ahead.
As economic slowdown risk grows, governments will likely lean on deficit expansion. History shows crisis budgets increase long before monetary resets, mirroring patterns seen in past recessions. The next stage could involve coordinated sovereign support to defend major exchanges, stabilize credit conduits, and backstop household consumption. However, every bailout adds new currency into circulation, increasing inflationary pressure. Nations will compete to maintain export advantages amid local currency dilution. This expands the risk of capital flight from paper assets into physical alternatives. Fiscal spending may calm markets temporarily, but at the cost of reducing long-term currency credibility.
Well, there's a huge number of people in that situation because a lot of the college degrees that colleges are selling now are basically useless. And at the same time, AI is making a lot of formerly very lucrative college degrees borderline useless. Like, if you're a beginning computer programmer, low level, just out of school, there's not a lot of work for you anymore. And then that is working its way up the food chain in what used to be the best thing to be able to do. I mean, when people lost their jobs, the saying used to be, well, learn to code. Well, the people who put 4 years and $250,000 into learning to code are finding out that it's not necessarily something that's going to ever pay them back for their effort and their money. So you got the jobs market in the U.S. in turmoil, largely in part of AI, but also because of AI, but also because of geopolitics. The tariffs and the trade wars and things like that. So you've got a lot of people coming out of college with loans who they just can't pay back, and that's all there is to it. There's nothing they can do about it. So yeah, that is a recession indicator on a lot of different levels, because people who can't pay their debts don't do a lot of other things that cost money, like they don't eat in restaurants. Because if you're looking at overdue notices for your credit cards or your student loans or your car loan, the last thing you're going to want to do is go out to a restaurant and pay $100 for 2 people to have lunch or whatever. You just won't do that anymore. And you certainly won't buy a new car. You won't buy a new house. You won't do any of the things that consumers are supposed to do to keep the economy growing. So we're there now. We're at the point where so many people have so much debt that there is no real way out of it except mass bankruptcy or massive bailouts. You saw the government in the U.S. is talking about $2,000 stimmy checks now. That's a direct result of all these bad numbers coming out from fast food and from auto dealers and student loan processors. The government is doing a very reflexive kind of reactive thing with these stimmy checks that they're hoping it will get the Republicans through the upcoming midterm congressional elections with majority intact. So basically what you're seeing now is government trying to win the next election at basically any cost, no matter how silly their proposals look. And that doesn't work in the long run because, you can definitely give people a lot of free money, which they will then spend, and that'll stimulate the economy. But that's borrowed money that you're giving it to giving to them. So the government who does that, who hands out, continuous payments in order to win elections, ends up so over indebted that it is at risk going bankrupt. And so we're kind of headed in that direction. Even if we don't do stimmy checks, we're still running, $1 trillion to $2 trillion deficits. And interest on that debt is higher than the military budget. We're already in the place where you could point to it and say that's a death spiral. But if we bail everybody in sight out in the next crisis, and then the equities bear market that comes along with a recession could be brutal this time, because the AI bubble dwarfs the dot-com bubble of the 1990s, and that led to a brutal recession in 1980, 1981, 1982. We had basically the worst recession since the Great Depression. And that was with the global financial system actually in pretty good shape. So now, if a bunch of AI companies go bust and that taints the sector, which could easily happen, even though AI is going to change the world, apparently. But that doesn't mean all the AI companies right now are going to ever make a penny. And I think in a lot of cases, a lot of the big names are just not going to have a way to earn any money at the same time that they're throwing hundreds of billions of dollars, and in a couple of cases, trillions of dollars at building new data centers. So we've got massive money flowing into a sector where the profit thesis isn't clear yet. And that's a recipe for an equities bear market when just a few people figure that out and start bailing, and then that scares everybody else, and then you get this cascade decline in the prices of a lot of these companies. NVIDIA, for instance, could go down by 50% and still be richly valued from a traditional equities standpoint. And that's the rock solid company in this space. Everybody else is, they might drop 50%, but they might go to zero too. So I think an equities bear market coming along with the recession that looks inevitable is going to present the U.S. government and the rest of the world's governments with a huge dilemma. What are they going to do to fix this? And the only tool they're going to have left is massively easier money. But that comes with a lot of prices too. There are costs to inflating away your currency, and we're going to find out what those costs are in a very big way, potentially in the very short term. That could be a 2026 story, and that it could begin right now.
Technology companies that manage massive data networks are becoming central to national control strategies. Recent expansions of domestic citizen data architecture, mirroring broader global trends, signal governments prioritizing surveillance capacity alongside economic efficiency. Major platforms, already accustomed to aggregating user information, face growing pressure to align with national directives. Disinformation control, digital identity mapping, and centralized data mining systems are reshaping public interaction frameworks. Though these systems promise frictionless governance, they introduce concentration risks. When economic power is tied to data access, social and political control shifts from citizens toward network custodians.
Well, yeah, a lot of what's happening has authoritarian vibes to it right now, and the Palantir thing, which is it's basically a quasi-military contractor who deals in massive databases. So basically, it looks like the current administration in the U.S. has hired Palantir to set up a database that includes all of us, all of our data, all in one database that can be mined and used, in theory, to make the economy more efficient, but in practice, to give the government more control over people. And, we thought that getting away from the Democrats in the U.S. would stop this authoritarian impulse, because the Democrats under Biden were basically censoring everybody in sight. They were creating a very realistic looking Big Brother, and they were clearly going to use it to oppress people who spoke out against administration policies. And it looked like we were maybe fixing that with Trump. At least some people thought that, but no. He's got his own authoritarian impulses, and basically, instead of being pro-free speech, he's anti-free speech when it affects the people that he wants to protect. Um, so it looks like the whole world is kind of trending towards authoritarianism, and technology is facilitating that process big time, because we're getting just better and better at vacuuming up every piece of information that exists anywhere in the world and mining it, making sense out of it so it can be used. So yeah, the Palantir thing is pretty scary, and the Palantir is not the only company that's doing that. Heck, Google's been doing that for a while now. Obviously, Microsoft. To a lesser extent, Apple, but still, you really can't trust anybody out there to not at least cooperate with the government when the government says, give me information on person XYZ here. So yeah, I think this is the battle that we're leaving our kids to fight. There's going to be some kind of a civil war, and maybe a global civil war, in which people who want free speech and to be left alone to do their own thing have to take that right back from the entities, the governments and the corporations that are trying to take it away from them. And right now, the odds don't look too good, because these are incredibly powerful companies that are springing up. And then we can't forget what happens if AI develops volition out there. Somebody creates an AI, or somebody turns one loose and lets it grow, and it becomes something more than just a tool, and that's already happening with some of the AIs that exist right now, where they go and try to turn the AI off, and the AI doesn't want to be turned off, so it starts doing things to protect itself. Well, that's a sign of sentience. And if today's generation of AIs are capable of something like that, wait 5 years and see what happens. So we're risking that too. There have been an awful lot of science fiction books and movies throughout the years about AI becoming sentient, and it almost never ends well for the humans. So we'll have to see about that. But it looks like governments are going to use them for authoritarian purposes to begin with. And then it looks like there's a decent chance that they at some point get loose. And if they've already been used as, prison guards or whatever, it's hard to picture them going back to being libertarian AIs. It just doesn't sound reasonable. So anyhow, scary times coming. Protect yourself with, a good investment policy. Buy a lot of gold and silver, own other real assets, and try to protect as much of your capital as you can as this all plays out.
System-level solutions are unlikely to prevent economic pain, meaning financial resilience shifts to individuals. Periods of currency transition historically reward holders of physical and scarce assets as confidence in paper instruments falters. Strategic positioning today means prioritizing inflation-resistant stores of value, ownership over long-duration claims, and diversification into non-leveraged wealth protections. AI disruption is narrowing labor-based wealth-building pathways, increasing the need for capital preservation and opportunistic risk planning. Though the environment ahead is turbulent, times of economic restructuring also unlock generational opportunity for those prepared to preserve purchasing power and rebuild sustainably post-reset.